Hello, I'm Bay McFarland with Mary's Advocates, working to uphold marriage and reduce unilateral no fault divorce. And I have with me Shaw, who's known in public as just for his YouTube channel. This is Shaw. I invited Shaw to talk to me and to all of you listeners because he had been posting stuff about Stephen Baskerville. And Baskerville is the guy who used to be, he was a college professor, and he's kind of the first person that, in a scholarly way, told the truth about what was really going on with no fault divorce. His first book was something about fathers, marriage, and Shaw. Do you remember the name of his first book? I'm drawing a blank.
The
It's on
earliest
my
one I remember
shelf.
is Taken into Custody.
I think
Um,
Taken into Custody: The
I
War
think that's
Against
one of his
Fathers.
biggest one or most popular one.
Yeah, it was Taken into Custody: The War Against, and then it's Father, Marriage, and the Family, and it might be in
Hmm.
that order. So, Shaw, what is it that, just because so our listeners can know, what kind of
Hmm.
content do you try to produce on your YouTube channel?
Well, when I started, I was still working at the child support agency, so I would just say, I'm just gonna make videos or react to things that annoy me in society, and this will be my outlet for me. And then I started finding content, especially like amongst men and what men watch a lot. And sometimes I'd see people talk about like child support and things like that. And I always thought, oh man, I wish I could make content for that just because some of the stuff would be wrong or just not entirely accurate. So I kind of started making content about child support. And that sort of rolls over into a lot of other things because then you start to see how child support affects families, how it's in the government and how it's just become this sort of gigantic program that gets into everybody's private lives. So I talk about that stuff a lot nowadays, but sometimes I do random stuff just because I'll probably go crazy if I talked about one thing all the time. So
Okay, and
yeah,
you're a former child support agent from
yes, yeah.
California, which is why I wanted to talk to you. Did you get fired because of your public
No,
events?
I did pretty well. I mean, I was there for a little over 5 years. Um, for the first 2 years, I was just a regular, we'd call them child support officers. That's basically like a child support agent. Every county in the U.S. has a child support agency,
Mhm.
and that's funded by the federal government. So, California has however many counties, and every county has an agency. Then they have a state child support program. So I worked for a county, Sacramento County, and I was a child support officer, level one. Then I was a level two, and I did that for a few years. And after a while, I kind of wanted to leave, but then, a higher position became available. I applied to become what's called the lead. So you're kind of a lead of a team. And I got the promotion, and then I was like, well, I'll do this for a bit. And then I got off probation because, when they start you, you're on probation. And then I did it for a little bit more after that. And, after a while, I felt like I learned plenty about the program. I probably could have kept moving up, but I just decided, for me, it just kind of wasn't for me anymore. And when I left, even the management was just like, "Oh, why are you going? I mean, you're on the leadership track. You should stay." But after a while, I was like, "Yeah, I think I need to step away for a bit." So I did well over there. I mean, I was a trainer for a bit. I trained all the new child
All right.
support
So you
officers.
mean
So
the reason I
yeah,
invited you to talk to my listeners is because
uh-huh.
you're like the inside guy to talk about, well, what's
Yeah,
really going on in these support agencies. And yeah, you're working in California, but a lot of the things you do would apply everywhere. Like the federal government
yes,
does fund. There's a formula for however number of dollars that a child support agency moves through, they'll get federal funding. Is
yeah.
what I
It's if you look into the laws that govern that through the Social Security Act, and this is Title 4D is the child support program specifically, where Title 4A is the welfare program. So, a lot of people might not know, but the federal child support program was created as a response to, burgeoning numbers in the welfare program and burgeoning out of wedlock births. So, we as a child support agency are sort of graded, and this determines our budget for the following year based off of what's called federal performance measures, and that's written into the Social Security Title 4D codes there. So one of them would be like cost effectiveness. Another one is how many child support orders did you establish? How much paternity did you establish for children born out of wedlock? How much child support did you collect as an agency? How much for like current payments? That means payments owed this month versus back pay for people who are in debt. So, stuff like that basically. And yeah, so we 100% are trying to live up to those measures, and it's going to determine how much money we get for the next year. So, child support. Yeah.
Let me paint a scenario here.
Mm-hmm.
If we lived in an idealistic world where nobody got pregnant outside of marriage and nobody ever got divorced,
Sure.
would a child support agency even exist? Maybe there'd be some widow somewhere, but there'd be no husband or father of the children
To go after. Yeah.
go after. Or
well,
so
I'll say this.
the agency exists because people are having children out of wedlock and because people are divorcing and separating. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, I mean, from a common sense understanding, that's very fair statement to say.
Okay.
I mean, that's what they would say. There's a lot of sort of this quintessential deadbeat dad or welfare queen. I will say that when the child support agency, the federal child support agency, was created, it was meant for a lot of these things. It originally, when it was created, it was only created to work what was called welfare cases. So it only applied to people who were living in a household where both parents weren't in there, and typically the mom, but the single parent was receiving welfare dollars for the children. So when that would happen, the government's basically like, we need to collect the welfare money back, and they're wanting to do that by going after the person not in the household and saying, hey, pay us this money back. But then it started to change, and what happened was it got more power in the mid 90s, around the 90s basically. And what they started to do is they started to advertise to people who were never on welfare to begin with and say, hey, you guys can come here too and get our services, because they're thinking, oh, if we get them a child support order now, this will stop them from needing to go on welfare in the future. And frankly, in my opinion, all that's really happened is it just created all these avenues for people to use. In my opinion, it kind of weakens marriage, because people then see this sort of governmental route that they can take advantage of to either get out of a marriage or never be married in the first place, whether that's welfare or child support. So welfare created child support, and then child support became this really powerful entity on its own. So so just to answer your question, if everybody was married and went away, or excuse me, if people weren't having kids out of wedlock, at this point, child support might even still exist, because you could be married, and if you guys if one or the other decides to leave or take the kids, they can walk into the child support agency and get services, even if they're not divorced. So it has become this thing that just doesn't care about marriage so much.
The perspective that I invited you to compare with me is the Catholic perspective that I'll try to explain simply.
Sure.
And what actually happens when the state gets involved. Because for Catholics, and I'm going to guess this has been a lot of people throughout the centuries, like what's going on right now is kind of newfangled. It didn't exist for, thousands and thousands of years, but that's for another discussion.
Yeah.
For Catholics, in an ideal world, I admit nobody's perfect. So nonetheless, when a man and a woman marry in the Catholic Church, there's some understandings. One of the understanding is we're going to be married till one of us die. Another one of the understandings is we're going to be open to having children together, and both of us together are going to jointly raise these kids. So if a woman marries a man, she knows up front, I'm not going to be booted out of the household and some other woman come in and replace me.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing.
That would be illegitimate. It would be void. The church wouldn't recognize that.
Well, I mean, if you went in with that intention, it's like,
Yeah.
I'm just hanging around with you as long as I feel like it. But then when I'm leaving and you can go find some other woman to take care of my kids, I don't really care. Like that, right. That wouldn't be Catholic marriage. The same thing from what I've read about divorce, most divorces nowadays are women against men when the men have done nothing grave. And from a Catholic perspective, there are some things that are so grave well, it's violations of a Catholic understanding of marriage. So I get it. A lot of people don't care about the Catholic understanding of marriage. They want to have sex with whoever wanted they have sex with. There's no expectation of permanence. I only want to be married to you until we fall out of love or whatever. I get it. There's people like that, but we're talking about the Catholics who get married. There are certain reasons that are legitimate reasons to be separated. So if a woman is committing adultery, and she has no intention of stopping, she is violating her marriage promises so severely that her husband has a legitimate reason to be separated from her. Catholics also have an understanding about the purpose of children. And the purpose of children is to propagate God's kingdom, where we're all raising people. We think people, when they're conceived, they're not only a human, they're also a person they're a human, but they also have a soul. So we think that little people are destined for eternity. So as parents, your mission as Catholics is to raise these kids so that they end up in eternity. So how you raise the kids is really important. If a mom is committing adultery flagrantly and she thinks that that's okay, the kids would never be expected to spend overnight visits with mom and her new adultering partner, where they get taught, mom and dad married, mom and dad are Catholic, mom dumped dad because she liked Mr. Jones, mom and Mr. Jones are sleeping together, and that's all normal. Like that wouldn't make sense, because part of raising children is protecting them from scandal. And scandal is when you teach somebody that something that's evil is actually good. Like Catholics use words like evil and good, it's not like your truth and my truth. It's like, no, some things are actually evil and some things are good. So these are some of the ideas that Catholics go into marriage with. Adultery is a reason for separation. The innocent party is always encouraged to forgive the other party. But if someone's flagrantly, like, I like Mr. Jones, you're a weirdo, that's a reason to be separated. Also, danger. If somebody is mentally disturbed to the point where they're dangerous to the kids or the other spouse, that's a reason to be separated. But it's not a reason to say you're not married anymore. It's just, wow. I have a legitimate reason to be separated you. And if you think about what's the purpose of marriage, it's part of raising these kids to have eternity. You want them to have a peaceful, morally grounded upbringing, and living with someone that's mentally disturbed to the point of being dangerous, you might have a legitimate reason to be separated. Yeah. But I make a contrast between separation and divorce, saying you're not married anymore. Did I explain that in a way that it makes sense?
Yeah, that sounds, it's funny because it just reminds me of a lot of the reasons someone can get an at-fault divorce before no fault. I mean, there was cruelty and abuse. There was adultery was one of them. I'm not super familiar with the Catholic stuff, but it is interesting. And sometimes I try to learn about the history of divorce. And what I kind of came to find out was, divorce was actually not allowed in the West, and there was just annulments, right? Then you're like, oh, what's an annulment? And then you learn about the ecclesiastical court. So it's like, oh, you have to look there because they're the ones doing that. So, yeah, it's funny because when you think of no-fault divorce, then, yeah, and you kind of compare it to what you're describing, no fault is something that's so new that hasn't been here in our society and that helped build a society for so long. I think the other reasons might have been like insanity or consanguinity or something like that, or
for a
someone didn't give consent
in the first place.
What was that?
When you're talking, those are reasons for annulment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not allowed to marry my dad.
Yeah.
Like, and my dad and I were kind of thinking, I'm sorry, Dad.
Yeah. So, but when you look at the history of,
if I was to walk down an aisle and make marriage promises with my brother,
yeah,
that is not a marriage. Or fraud.
They would say this needs to be annulled because this shouldn't have been a marriage in the first place.
Exactly. It was we have a term for it, but right. But that also is based on justice and natural law. Like a common one I hear about is shotgun wedding. Some pioneer guy knocks up some lady or young, some teenager, and then the dad's like, "Look, my daughter's pregnant.
You gotta make an honest woman out of her.
No guy is ever going to be interested in her. You marry her, or else." And the guy marries her. Well, that's fear. That's force and fear. And part of marriage is that you have to go into it with your own free will. If you're under pain of murder to be married, that's another reason that it's invalid. But
Okay.
you could say that about any contract, you know, like someone says, buy my car for $1 or I'll kill you. You're like, ah.
Yeah, the court would say, well, no, that's not a valid contract. We're going to throw that out. There needs to be consent, in other words, I think is what you're saying.
Since you're talking about annulments in the
Mhm.
history, in any society, there is governance. Somebody has to govern it. I was talking to a lady yesterday whose grandma was in a Native American tribe, and they had tribal governance. The society had to have somebody would have to establish so the people know how we're going to get along, and then who's in charge of enforcing it in case someone's violating how we're going to get along. And
Yeah.
that exists in the state and in the government else. And the church said no. And as a
Mhm.
result, he's like, well, then fine, I'm going to start my own church. I mean, that was.
Yeah,
So
I think up until then it was United Christendom. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know if, and then that kind of broke away, and I know there's the whole Protestant Reformation and all that stuff.
Yeah, that was going along around that same time.
Yeah.
So, the church has governance of how marriage is managed and the
Mhm.
obligation of spouses towards each other and their children, with this vision of our purpose here is to raise these people to spend eternity in heaven.
Mhm.
And then the state also has governance, but the church existed before Ohio or California or United States existed.
Yeah.
So it's like on Mary's Advocate's website, I'm citing sources that are from the 1700s. I've got the Council of Trent from 1563. It's like the church has some things that go way, way back on how the church governs itself. And what I wanted to ask you about
Mhm.
is there's this thing in the Catholic Catechism that says there are certain circumstances where civil divorce is tolerable.
Okay.
And it's only supposed to be tolerable first if someone has a legitimate reason to be separated in the first place. So most women who are divorcing their husbands for no fault reasons, those women don't even have a reason to be separated from their husband at all.
Yeah.
Well-
They'll just say irreconcilable differences and not give a reason really either. than
Right,
that.
right. So the husband can be just a normal guy.
Yeah.
And then he's faced with, but what's happening amongst the Catholics, at least, is that what I see is church leadership kind of got caught, blindsided when no fault came through. Because 80 years ago, if a man abandoned his wife, he might have all the guys in town grab him and like beat him up, tell him to go home. He might be committing a crime where the police would come after him. If a man's committing adultery, same thing. It might be a crime. If a woman is trying to cheat with somebody else's, like breaking marriage promises, the society considered to be bad for society. So they would enforce the same kind of things that for centuries the church was enforcing. So in the old days, if someone was, here's a case. You have a mom and a dad, they live out in Kansas.
Sure.
The dad abandons the mom. He go find some new girlfriend over the Missouri River. The mom is like, oh my gosh, I got this property. I don't have any husband to help me. Our oldest son is 12. What am I going to do? She could go to the government and she could get help to make that husband support her. But he left and she needed the help.
Yeah, that would be a criminal thing that he's doing. He's abandoning and neglecting his family. And that would run through the criminal court even. Where now it's like it doesn't really become a criminal thing, even if it might be on the books. What they'll do is they'll send it through family court and, welfare and child support and say, well, this is the monetary amount you owe. And it changed hands, so to speak, into this new program to handle all that stuff.
So like nowadays, that's what they did 80 years ago. Nowadays, if a woman, her kids are teenagers, she doesn't have any babies at home anymore. She works part-time. She's sick and tired of her husband. She got a full-time job. She likes working outside the home. She doesn't like her husband anymore. But he's not doing anything wrong. In California, what could that woman do that would involve your agency?
Well, I mean,
or might eventually involve your agency. So that if she and her husband are living together, can she do anything in your agency yet if they're married?
Typically not. Typically not if they're cohabitating. I have, as funny as this is, I have seen some cases where child support was ordered, and what they did was they used like a 50-50 custody kind of thing just to split it down the middle, even though they're in the same thing. That doesn't typically happen. That's a
Okay.
real edge
So
case. But while she's still the thing that the state looks at is cohabitation, mostly, right? Because
okay.
then custody's shared between you guys. But you can still be married, and then mom can leave and take the kids, and you know what I mean, go somewhere else. At that point, she can go to the child support agency and say, hey, I want you guys to
She moves in with her boss.
yeah,
Her
let's say
boss.
new
She and the
boyfriend,
boss
boss,
get along
whatever.
so fantastically. He feels sorry for her because her husband is such a bore. He's like, you
Yeah,
can move in with me, sweetheart. So then what? So now she's no longer living with her husband, and the husband's like, where's my wife? This is terrible. She promised to raise kids Catholic. Oh no. So
yeah,
could she do something with your agency then?
yeah. I mean, she can, if the kids are living with her, even if the kids are 50-50, let's say they're going 50-50, but the husband makes more money than her, and she got a job. Let's say she's making 50K and the husband's making 100K, and it's 50-50 custody. She can still walk into our agency and, at the taxpayer's expense, fill out an application, and we will get a child support order based off a calculator that says he makes 100 grand, she makes 50. Let's just put in 50-50 custody, and it's going to give her some amount of money from the husband, regardless, even though they're still married. And then if the husband says, well, I have the kids 50% of the time, me as the caseworker, I'm going to say, yeah, I understand that. But, according to the law, since the kids are going back and forth, they're entitled to a sort of similar lifestyle between households. Therefore, we're going to take money from you. And he's going to say, but I didn't do anything wrong. I mean, she just decided to leave one day. I didn't cheat on her. I didn't abuse her. I didn't neglect or abandon her or the kids or anything like that. And there's nothing we're going to be able to do about that at all.
Sean, do you have real conversations like that? Like husbands would tell you what's on their mind?
Yeah, a lot. Honestly, those are the ones I felt the most bad for. I mean, it was a terrible situation for everybody, but whenever I'd see a family, like, because I look on my computer and I'd see the names, so my eyes are just trained with names, and it's like the mom has the last name, the dad has the last name, the kids have the last name, and then suddenly, dad's in the office talking to me, I would always feel bad because it's like, oh no, a beautiful family got broken up. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of on the light side of it. I've heard all kinds of things, I've sorry, go on.
In that situation, if she's living with the boss and he
Mhm.
earns 200 grand, does the
Oh.
boss's
It
amount
doesn't figure in. It does not figure in at all because, well, so there's a thing called presumption of marriage for paternity, and
But the kids are already teenagers. They want to move in with the boss because he's more fun and he's rich.
the boss's income isn't really going to play into that. We're assuming they're unmarried, right? She's just living with
We're
the boss.
assuming she's still married to the guy.
Yeah,
She's married to
yeah,
her original husband.
yeah. Even if they are married, we would only use his income just to figure out child support for her to see what her net is after taxes. But his income wouldn't. We couldn't touch his income. But what matters is who's legally the parents of the child. So those kids are teenagers and they were born within the marriage of her and her actual husband. So there's a thing called presumption of paternity when it comes to marriage, and we presume that any, issue of the wife, especially when they're cohabitating, he's the father. But let's say, cheating and adultery back then wasn't a thing, but he is. His income, the new guy's income's not going to matter. It's just about who the legal parent is, and the husband is the legal parent. So that's who we as the child support agency are coming after. We don't care. I mean, listen, I've seen a case where a couple was married and they had like, I think it was 2 or 3 kids. I can't even remember. I remember very vividly because I heard my coworker in the cubicle next to me talking to this guy, and he used to work on the advanced collections team. And that was cases where guys hadn't paid for years, and this guy would refuse to pay. And I remember this guy got off the phone from talking to him, and he just had to get up to talk to somebody, so he decided to talk to me. And he was just like, if I was that guy, I don't know how I would keep it together. I'd probably lose it. And basically, that guy was married to someone, had a couple kids, and that woman left and took the kids and went to go live with some other guy.
Yeah.
And that guy she lived with was her ex-boyfriend that she had been cheating with the whole time she was with this guy, and the kids were actually biologically his. That's what the guy was telling him on the phone. And we as the agency don't care because he's been legally the father for,
Presumption
you know,
of paternity.
yeah, for over 2 years. If you're going to challenge that in California, you have 2 years, and it's not a guarantee they'll undo the paternity because it depends on the relationship. It depends on if there's another guy, a lot of things. But that guy was like, no way, we're not going to pay. And us as the agency, we have so much power that anytime he gets money, we'll levy his bank, and we take that money and we send it to the household of this essentially cheating wife with her, with who the real father of these kids are. However, because of the way the laws work, this guy who's not even the real father got cheated on is the one we're taking. It's almost like a forced slavery. I mean, yeah, I don't know how he would keep it together, but yes, it can get
And
that
the
bad.
money, he's not voluntarily writing a check. That money, the agency has the power to go to his bank and say, give us the money.
Yeah, we would typically we would send a wage assignment if he's got like a regular job. We just send a wage garnishment. That's most people. If he's self-employed or something and we can't just take the money, we'll call him as much as we can. If he doesn't want to pay, we'll cut his licenses off, which is kind of stupid because then nobody
Driver's
gets
license.
money.
I know people that's happened to.
Driver's license, yeah, any kind of license, from fishing license up to medical license, we can take it away. And then, or we'll try to throw him in jail or bank levies, or we'll intercept tax refunds, things like that. And yeah, we go in there and we take it.
Okay, so I'm going to swing this back to the same scenario. The lady's got teenagers. She's bored with her husband. She likes the boss now that she's working full-time instead of part-time. If she and the husband are living together and she files for divorce for no-fault grounds, because that's what you get in California.
Yeah.
Could you get involved then while they're still in the same household?
While they're still in the same household?
Because she filed for divorce, so she's expecting after however many months it's going to be issued.
If they're still cohabitating and there's no welfare involved, typically we won't. It's not really until one or the other party leaves the household that we will. I know there was that one case, but that was I'm not even really sure what exactly was the reason they decided to do that. I think they knew they were going to be moving out soon, and they both agreed, so they started it early. Okay. But typically, if they're still in the same household and they're still cohabitating, and there's no welfare involved, then you're not going to hear about us. But if it's like, if it's very early on, typically what we're going to do is we're going to watch. Someone might give us a request for services, and we're going to watch the ongoing legal battle through private family law, which is their divorce case. Now, they might decide to not follow up on their divorce case, and mom might leave with the kids, or dad just might leave. Or who knows what will happen. But once they end up separated, even if the divorce is ongoing or if it just hasn't picked up, then we'll get involved and we'll then file to do a child support order alongside of that. And what will happen is we can get child support flowing while these folks are still fighting about their divorce.
I'm thinking of an example. I know two guys who the divorce court evicted them from their home. And Baskerville talks about this a lot. Like, you can be a normal guy.
Yeah.
If you're, and from a Catholic, I'm making a presumption that, and it may or may not be true, Catholic moms, because the upbringing of children is so much a part of the Catholic understanding of marriage, one parent in a Catholic home, I'm going to guess, is going to be more interested in the upbringing of the children than if you were just some people who had kids, but you were very comfortable letting the state raise your kids, and you're very comfortable letting media raise your kids, and you're just not as interested in the.
Sure. I mean, I could see that because it's about, instilling in the children what your personal values and beliefs are.
Yeah.
If you're part of the herd mentality with the state, then you're just going to let the school and the state do it.
So
unless you have some
assumption that couples that are Catholic couples that are married are more interested in the formation of their children than people who totally love the state and think the state should do everything. So in those situations, when the kids are little, I'm going to say that there's usually a stay-at-home parent or some parent working part-time if they can afford it. So it's very common that one learns more than the other. So I'm just going to say, for the sake of discussion, because a lot of the women and men I deal with, the men were working full-time. Mom was a stay-at-home mom when the kids were little, or only working full-time. So I'm just going to talk about that.
Yeah. I can see that. I think that'd be typical for a pretty religious household. I know
of two cases like that where the dads got evicted from their own home by the divorce court. And I think as soon as he was evicted, like child support, if like you're saying, they're not going to do a child support order if they're both in the same home because the money's going into the same pool to feed the kids and drive them around and whatever, get their clothes and their beds and stuff. But once they're in separate homes, well, the divorce court will evict the dad because it's better for children to have a stable environment. And in general, we don't serve the children. So children are in this home. Somebody's got to leave. Well, dad's the one that
dad, most likely.
Put them out.
Yeah, typically it is dad, and the courts have the power to do that. You know, they can order that, and if it's not, you know, the family court specifically, you know, if you know, you can get into the stuff about false abuse claims and things like that. Like somebody can go in and file a temporary restraining order and get somebody taken out very fast, and that's before there's an actual restraining order. This is like, oh, we have to believe what you're saying because if we don't do this now, you could really get hurt. But then they set out a hearing that could be, you know, 8 weeks, 3 months from now, depending on how backed up the court is. And the meantime, dad's been gone the whole time because he hasn't been able to go in there. By that time, child support's already got involved because we're like, oh, somebody's not in there. You know what I mean? And then mom at the same time can run to the welfare agency at the same time and start getting welfare monies for the kid. Then that's when we have to get involved. The welfare agency sends us a service request, and then we're in it to win it at that point.
Because the situation, I'm thinking of a guy that I was collaborating with a long time ago, and his wife was getting advice from one of these crisis women's centers.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You could be a normal guy that's just kind of boring to your wife, and she can go to a women's crisis center and she can learn at our tax dollars how to navigate all this. And these centers were set up for the women who actually are abused. Baskerville talks about this too, I think. They're set up for the women who are abused or the men. But then what happens is everyone else can use them. And then me as the public dealing with marriage and divorce, it's like, I don't know if you're actually abused at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. I hear other creators talk about that, and they talk about the expansion of the definition of abuse. Because, you know, if you look at cruelty and abuse, that was part of at-fault divorce as a criteria for a very long time. So it's something that was recognized. It's funny because whenever I hear people who sometimes, you know, conservatives every now and then will talk about bringing at-fault divorce back into play, and the other side will come out and say, so you want women to just be abused in marriage and have no way out? Which is, it's complete hyperbole, because it's like, well, cruelty and abuse was part of a reason to be able to get out of an at-fault marriage for a long time. So it's kind of this weird thing that they say. But what abuse was, I mean, then it's been expanded to, there's, you know, like financial abuse, for instance, is one thing. And I don't know what the other one, maybe emotional abuse. It's become very interpretive at this point. So, you know, you've seen that explode, basically. And yeah, that's the tough thing about it. So, you know, we're supposed to take that very seriously, but it's like, were they really abusing them? Is this a false claim? And once the false claim comes out that it was a false claim, by that time the damage is done. The family's broken up. They're in different households, you know?
And the dad's been out for however long. And for a dad to forgive a wife who's done that, or trust a wife who's done that,
that's tough.
It's tough. See, I work with people who want their marriages to be reconciled. So they're the abandoned one. They're the one where the other spouse has committed adultery or is actually dangerous and they have a legitimate reason to be separated, but they want that person to be formed. They don't want to be going out and finding a new partner. What I think is, if that other person, let's say the other person was actually abused, you know, so I'm talking to a husband, he's like, my wife says I emotionally abused her. And what I think is, well, you know what? If your wife really believed that you emotionally abused her and she believes in her Catholic marriage promises, she would be doing everything she could to get you the right kind of help. She would want to go with you to counseling. She'd want to find support groups where people have similar problems that you have, whether you're an alcoholic or you have anger issues or you're a lazy bum or you don't know how to communicate because you work all the time. I mean, whatever it is, if the wife is sincere about actually being abused, and she's a half normal Catholic, her solution wouldn't be, I need to get my no-fault divorce. It would be, I need to get you the right kind of help. Please, please, I'll do whatever I can to go along with it. And it might be really uncomfortable. That wife will be putting up with some stuff that's pretty uncomfortable, but her goal, I want my kids to be raised so that they end up in eternity. And I want to model the love to my husband that I promised when I got married, because I said good times and bad, sickness and health, and this happens to be a bad time. You are a piece of work and you're driving me crazy and I don't know what to do. So
well, I'd say, it's a lot of marriage in the original, I mean, at least part of what I guess was a big intention of marriage to begin with is about the kids and making sure that your guys, both of you, the wife and the husband's children are cared for and grow up in a way that's going to be best for them. And then, like you say, for Catholic folk,
it's
right.
Eternal. It's here. I want you to be a responsible citizen with a decent work ethic, and and you're not.
But nowadays,
you're helpful and you're kind and you're generous.
Yeah, and no fault divorce seems to cater more so to kind of an individual's happiness, whether the mom or the dad's. And the biggest losers in this entire thing is the children. It's interesting when I think about annulments, and I sometimes think about the sort of church's position in all this. I've read interesting things that a lot of the contributions, monetarily from donations to the church nowadays come from a lot from women. So I've heard, and a buddy of mine is Catholic, and he has been. I forgot what the classes are called, but there's some kind of classes he goes to where they discuss marriage, and it's something he's supposed to do for the church, So
is he already married, or
No, he's prior. He's not married. But he was telling me about it, and he was asking the person who was proctoring it. I think it might have been a Catholic priest or.
Okay, so there's.
And the thing I always wondered about is, it's one thing if they get a state divorce, but from what I understand, is if you get a state divorce, they're still married, through the religion. And if one person has done that and they're now with another boyfriend, they're not able to, I think, do the Eucharist or the sacraments or this kind of thing for the church. But I think what's an interesting conversation, and I don't know much about it, it's just something I've kind of peripherally seen because my buddy told me too, is what he learned in this class is it seems like a lot of times the church is making it easier to get annulments for a lot of these scenarios where maybe before they didn't do it as much. Because what he said is he asked the person and he said, yeah, well, what we do is we just say that they didn't understand what they were signing up for in the first place. And that's kind of the reason they used to give the annulment, which is interesting. And it kind of leads me to think that the church is in this tough position where it's like, if they don't give on giving the annulments, they risk maybe losing a lot of the congregation from being able to come back and participate. It was just interesting to hear that from him. And then it made me think like, oh, how is the church dealing with no fault divorce? Because they're in a tough position. Yeah, where they can't legally enforce something, but they can only do it from a spiritual side.
What I found going back to, I want to say the 1860s, and I'm going from memory. So if you really want to quote me, I got to go double check my sources.
Sure.
But around the world for a long time, there might not have been civil divorce at all. Once you're married, married, he dies.
Yeah.
Then this notion of the state having control over marriage came in, and the state was issuing these divorces. The state was doing enforceable support orders, for example. The pioneer who's out in the next neighboring state, the government will go in and say, we got to get this money from you somehow or whatever. Throw them in jail.
Yeah.
So I'm getting off track. So then when the state was getting involved with civil divorces, the church knew, well, this is just a government thing. All this really is actually a separation of married spouses. These people are married. They're separated. I read a situation where somewhere in the world, a woman who was morally, legitimately separated from her husband couldn't be employed unless she had a civil divorce.
Oh, wow.
She was supposed, maybe women and husbands are so connected. It's like, well, we can't have you work here as a woman who's not living with your husband. So it was like a weird situation. And in that situation, the bishops, the governance of the church in her territory, he didn't even have authority to decide whether or not she could get a civil divorce. He had to write to the hierarchy in Rome, the headquarters of the world of the church. So one of the sources that I see, I've got a lot of doctoral dissertations on my shelf about separation and divorce throughout history. So there's this one case that shows up in a couple of these things. It's like, well, the first time they were talking about divorce even being tolerable is this one case. And the hierarchy of the church came down to the bishop and says, okay, on a one-time basis, this woman could get a civil divorce, but it had to be very clear that everybody knows she's still married to the husband, and people aren't going to be going to the civil court on their own authority. No way, because the church has governance over our own marriages. The state may or may not.
Yeah.
And then
no, go on, please.
So then there was also annulments. Annulments have been around where, just kind of the way I would describe it, it's based in natural law. So if I live in some weird area where somebody thought it was okay for me to marry my brother, the church would say, whoa, that's not a marriage. So the church could say that's not a marriage. And then we'd all know that that's not a marriage. Or if somebody lied about wanting to have kids, if you lied about wanting to have kids, that's fraud.
Yeah.
You know,
I look at annulments. My understanding of it is this is the church saying that, well, this marriage was not supposed to happen in the first place because there was this reason that
what
that
actually
made that null.
What actually occurred when those two people spoke their marriage promises, it was a void and null marriage. Just like if someone, and I can imagine a void contract for similar reasons. Like if someone takes a check, I don't know, we had tornadoes in my area. So my neighbors got a new roof. Like if they paid a roofer $3,000 because he was going to do their roof, and then he just never did, and he wasn't even a real roofing company. Well, the contract they signed is null and void. They don't owe him $3,000. The guy lied. He's not a roofer. So it's like we have the same thing where you could agree to something on paper, but it's null and void. Or if someone was really, really drunk or insane or not capable, like there are things like a child. There's reasons that we have children can't enter certain kinds of contracts.
And I think Baskerville discusses this a bit too, but there's this concept of like justice, like there needing to be an injured party, in whatever gets kind of brought up to the court. So one party did something that injured the other party, whether in the contract or whatever. No fault kind of does away with this system. And, as no fault comes in, morality, unfortunately, is not, able to work with that. It's just like, well, this is more just an administration type deal right here, where it's more just like, well, okay, split everything 50-50. Nobody was injured technically, even though somebody totally could have got cheated on, or all kinds of terrible things could have happened. And there is an injured party, but they don't care about that. Even if you're the injured party, you may be the one having to pay, to the person that injured you. So it's what I might be wrong. I'm not exactly sure how Dr. Baskerville says it, but I think that's kind of what's rooted in the common law understanding of this whole injured party. And then it moves over into this other type of thing that doesn't even incorporate that. So that was the biggest change. Yeah,
you're talking about, you look at your formula to see what the child support's going to be. It's just based on his income, her income, where the kids are.
Exactly.
And then there's no injured party. There's no violation. There's no interest in whether there was an injured party. And
sorry, go ahead.
I want to swing back to where I was trying to go, but I stopped myself or whatever about the annulment thing. The United States is kind of gone rogue about annulments, if that's the right word. There's in certain circles, a very well-respected Cardinal Raymond Burke. And in the world of the church, there's your local tribunal in your diocese. There's appellate tribunals in neighboring dioceses. There's also an appellate tribunal in Rome that's called the Roman Rota. And then there's a higher one than that's called the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. And this guy, who's now Cardinal Raymond Burke, had worked as the defender of the bond in marriage cases. If someone thinks they have an invalid marriage, they submit a petition to the church. Like, hey, I think I have an invalid marriage. It's supposed to say, here are the grounds, and here's some proof supporting the grounds to get the investigation rolling. Cardinal Burke talks about how when he worked at the Signatura, this highest tribunal in the world, he saw lots of cases in the United States where the U.S. tribunals were, I'm paraphrasing, cutting corners, doing it wrong, giving annulments when they shouldn't have been giving annulments.
Okay, and the reason it ends up to him is because then one party probably appeals it up this higher ecclesiastical court ladder, basically.
Yep.
So then
And
he can see, yeah, these guys are doing it wrong over here.
And
I can see that.
Right now we have Pope Francis, but before him we had Pope Benedict, and before him we had Saint Pope John Paul II. Both John Paul II and Pope Benedict criticized the abuse of the psychological grounds for annulment. Because, like,
really?
You talked about with your situation with the acquaintance you have who's Catholic, and the person gave him a simplified version, like he didn't really know what he's doing. There is a ground that says if a person lacks the use of reason, that could be a grounds for annulment. But I come back and I think, wait a minute, you're going to be seriously dating somebody.
That sounds like insanity to me, right? Like maybe it sounds like maybe that original ground, if that's in the Catholic doctrine or canon law. Yeah, canon law. That sounds like another way of saying, well, if the person is insane, frankly, because they lack reason. But they're probably so it sounds like they're expanding that or interpreting it to mean to apply to psychological abuse or however they want to fit that in there. So they're using it incorrectly.
There's lack of reason, and then there's another one where they're incapable of doing the essential obligations of marriage for serious pathologies. And I've read that this one applies to, evidently, there are people out there who are seriously addicted to sex. Like anytime they're upset about something, they go hire a prostitute. Like people.
Yeah. I mean, I believe it. There's sex addicts out there.
So if someone was like that during their courtship and during the early years of the marriage and during the marriage, the person was actually incapable. I joke, I'm really tall, so I joke with my kids, I'd never be a horse jockey. So if I signed up to be a horse jockey and I'm like, yeah, I'm 5'2" and I weigh 97 pounds. And they're like, wait a minute, that's not true. You're not.
Yeah.
I'm actually incapable of being a world-class horse jockey. I'm just too heavy. I'm too big. It's not possible. So it's like, that's a ground for an invalid marriage. But how often does that happen?
I don't know if that happened. I mean, I'm sure it didn't happen often, but it's, and it shows a lot of subtlety that there's room for that in, the Catholic tradition, because I think a lot of people will probably look at that nowadays and be like, oh, well, they're just going to force you to, do all these things you don't want to do. But the ecclesiastical courts were here for a long time, and there's probably a lot of cases over time you can find where there's, precedent for certain things. But I doubt it happened often. I doubt it happened often because it maybe doesn't occur that much actually.
Then there's a third one that has to do with psychological grounds. And I don't have a doctorate in philosophy or psychology, so I'm just going to try to explain it in the way I talk from what I've studied. The words in the canon law is grave lack of discretion of judgment. And what it means, Thomas, when we choose to do something, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in our psyche that happens instantly that you never think about it happening. And one of the things is our intellect, which is how we're taking in information with our senses, what we know, what we remember. So we're taking stuff in with our intellect, and then we're choosing to do something with our will. So this grave lack of discretion of judgment applies to people whose intellect and will are broken somehow. Maybe, it's actually hard for me to imagine that this happens. I guess there are people, but I keep going back. It's like if someone was that and we're only talking about the essential properties of marriage too. So we're not saying that the man is capable of being his wife's best friend and be supportive and making her feel loved and precious.
Doing grand romantic displays.
You know what? Hey, you're living in 1870 and you live on a farm in Kansas and your husband's a farmer and he works 77 hours a week. Okay. It's like that. So we're not talking about someone who I'm going off on a tangent here. What matters is the psychological ground that's used a ton in the United States is it's 1095-2. It's grave lack of discretion of judgment. It's only supposed to apply to people who have a serious psychopathology, making their intellect and will incapable of functioning like the rest of humanity. And for a while there, this Canon Law Society would publish statistics on the diocese of the United States. And I cross-checked those with this other source that tells you the numbers of marriages happening in a diocese.
Mm-hmm.
And the Canon Law Society stopped publishing those in 2016. But when I was cross-checking them, there are some dioceses, for every 4 weddings that occur in a diocese, there's an annulment.
Oh, wow. That's a lot. I mean, I think that's a lot for a church, right? Like,
Yeah. So I'm like,
yeah,
okay. I mean, we have
that's
all
almost, I mean, if you look at the population at large when it comes to civil divorce, and if it's around just under half of first marriages ending divorce, and if the church is at about 1 in 4, that's pretty high. That's pretty high, especially when you look back to like at-fault divorce times where divorce, well, children born out of wedlock was only 5%. So, divorce and things like that were very rare. You have to ask kind of what is it that changed in the church or the way that they're doing stuff that's leading to this. I think, obviously I don't know. I'm just someone watching from the outside, and it looks like there is a lot of probably pressure there, and there's a lot of things about how our society works now where someone can just get up. They are so incentivized to just get up and leave and abandon their faith and say, well, I got this job now. I make $80,000 a year. I don't need to get married and all these kinds of things. And I think it's tough because they have to find out, how do you appeal? How do you keep these people in here? And maybe they think, well, if we yield on this, then we can really get them strong on their faith so that they can understand these things later.
See, but
it doesn't come to this at a, I don't know why they're doing it. It's interesting.
Jokes, and she says, well, how's that working out? Because the number of young people who take their Catholicism seriously is dropping and dropping. Generations ago, we had all these full churches, and now they're having to close churches because there's just not enough people. But that's kind of wow, we really are going all over the place.
Well, it's interesting too, because all this other stuff makes it harder. So if you're a guy and you want to be a provider and do all these things, it's very hard to want to be that if you're going to see, not only is the state not going to back me up on this, but the church probably also is going to be able to give an annulment really easily. So it's just really tough for the guys at this point, because they may want to do it traditionally. It's just very hard for them to do that. And if they do that, there might be a heavy cost to pay that can put guys in some dark places.
I help people appeal. I mean, I deal with the man who's been dumped by his wife because she thinks he's boring, and she files an annulment, and then she's coached by one of these tribunals that gives them easily to just say, oh, I had a grave lack of discretion of judgment. And then I help show how, like, wait a minute, she didn't have a serious psychopathology when we got married. She was a happy person. Come on, this is not right.
Yeah, and that's kind of what my buddy was telling me, because I always kind of wondered too. It's just like, oh, well, that's interesting, because they're still spiritually married, so it's like, how's this going to happen, And when he was telling me with his discussion, it sounds like it's, you obviously know exactly what the different grounds are from the Catholic side, but it sounds like they've been able to exploit one of these to a degree in which makes this.
Yeah, and this is an issue that's a controversy amongst church leadership. If we've got 2 popes saying, look, there's something wrong here.
Yeah.
So,
it's funny. It reminds me, I'll see if I can find it just while we're talking here. I'll try not to get too distracted. But I remember there was an article, and it was about the Catholic Church. This was probably like in 2017 or so. And it was about what it seemed like making annulments kind of easier. I wish I can find annulment reform.
For centuries, if one thought they had an invalid marriage, they'd go to their local diocese and they'd petition, and then the local diocese tribunal would investigate and make a decision. But that annulment decree could not go into effect until a second diocese looked at the case record and reviewed it.
Verified it. That makes sense.
That second review was eliminated in 2000.
Yeah, because the other people who maybe don't know them personally might be more likely to say, hey, this isn't valid or something, right?
Yeah, or at least a double check. So this automatic second review was eliminated in 2015 by Pope Francis.
Okay. Yeah, here it is.
Was publicly saying there's a reason to have this, and if you're a good judge, you don't mind having someone review it. So that might be what you're remembering. And then Pope Francis also issued a thing where the bishop himself could issue an annulment decision. Prior to that,
it had to be someone higher, huh?
Well, actually, it was lower. The bishop.
Oh,
I mean, the bishop I think a bishop's job description is humanly impossible. He's like supposed to be Jesus to these thousands of people, and
Sure.
he's supposed to be a governance, and he's supposed to be teaching, and he's supposed to be doing sacrifices.
Yeah, looking at people's
But
annulment, questions and things.
the bishop would have an office that works for him that was called the tribunal, and that's canon lawyers that would do annulment cases. What Pope Francis said is, you know what? Some of these cases are so straightforward. We're going to skip the tribunal, and you can go right to your bishop, and he can say, boom, annulment. And in some situations, if it's a really clear-cut case, okay, but that only even applies. But what the public was hearing was it got simplified, it got easier, it got quicker.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. I found the article. This was from The Guardian 9 years ago, 2015, and it says, the Vatican is making it much easier for Catholics to annul their marriages following a push by Pope Francis for reformation of a process long criticized for being complicated, costly, and out of reach for many. But yeah, so it's interesting too, because one other thing I thought about is if you have maybe one church doing it this way and another church over here that maybe makes all these processes easier, it almost seems like people might gravitate or kind of go to this other church, almost like people used to do forum shopping for divorce back in the at-fault days. Like they might go to Nevada. They might live in, a different state and say, let's go to Nevada. And, Nevada became popular and created an entire industry of couples coming over and living there for a short amount of time, so then they can then apply to the courts to get a divorce because they had the most lax rules during that time. So I can almost see a similar thing happening at.
But yeah, and the Catholic Church, unlike the Protestant churches where a minister can say, you know what, I have such a disagreement with whatever this established entity is that I'm part of, that I'm going to split away and do my own thing. Yeah. Catholics say, we're one. We are one church. We're started by one person. We're going to be around until he comes back. So we're supposed to be the same everywhere. You're not supposed
it has a centralized going back to Rome. So that would make sense, right?
So, it's human beings, so it's going to have kinks and wrinkles, and this is a thing that's kinks and wrinkles. I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
I mean, pretend, my best case scenario, in the United States, all the bishops have a committee. They call themselves the USCCB, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And in there, they have an office of like laity and family. So if you and I were in front of them and I'm like, hey guys, here's my friend Shaw that I know so well. And he used to work in the Catholic Support Agency. I would like him to explain to you what happens in a situation where, from the Catholic perspective, a spouse has a legitimate reason to be separated, but what's going to happen to the family in the California divorce system and support system? And I want to give you a couple of different scenarios.
Okay.
So the scenario is the woman who'd been working, a stay-at-home mom, working part-time, full-time husband. She's bored of her husband. Her kids are teenagers. She files for divorce.
Okay.
In California, what will happen to that family in coming months and years with the dad and the mom?
Yeah, I mean, unilaterally, she can file for divorce, and the husband's going to be the breadwinner, and the courts will grant it. Once they look at the assets, and they're going to divvy up everything. You know what I mean? They're going to look at the house, and they're going to say, okay, what's going to happen here? And whether they're living together at the time or she takes the kids and lives with her parents, eventually the house will either be sold or one or the other is going to need to buy the other out, right?
Court and says, you know what? I only moved in with my parents temporarily. I want to live in the marital home. I want the court to give me the home, and the kids want to live in the home too, and we want dad to be out.
I'll tell you this: if she's living with her parents and the kids are with her, even 50% of the time, immediately, while they're going through their divorce, even if it's not finished, you can get a support order established. You can get child support having to be paid while this is ongoing. You can get alimony, and there's things like temporary spousal support and all this kind of stuff. So she can do that, and the courts are going to start acting immediately. Now, if she applies privately, she'll probably have an attorney, and then she'll do this. If she says, hey, this isn't enough, I'm going to go apply for welfare while I'm living in my parents' house for these kids. The minute she does that, the welfare agency is going to send an electronic service request to the child support agency we're going to see that, and we're immediately going to start our case to get child support now that these kids are receiving the cash aid. So then we're going to have, and if this is a normal guy with a normal above the table job, I mean, we can have this order done very fast and in our system being enforced to where we have an income wage assignment sent over to his job. So all that stuff's gonna happen quick, alongside the divorce. Now they might just order child support in the divorce themselves without our agency, but then once she gets that order, she can walk across the street over to our agency and we'll just enforce it for her.
So this husband can get his wages garnished, and let's say that she was a stay-at-home mom. So they're living pretty much month to month with some savings.
Mm-hmm.
He gets his wages garnished for spousal and child support.
Yeah.
He can't afford the bills on the house. He's got a mortgage. He's got utilities. He's got 2 cars because the wife took the car.
Yeah,
right?
That's the worst part. And just so you know, the child support agency enforces, so long as we're enforcing child support, we also enforce a spousal support order. So all the same stuff we're going to do to him if he's not paying the spousal. So she can get her spousal and child support order, come to us, we'll enforce it for free with all the power we have. And here's the tough part, right? He's paying for one household, which is already tough. The minute she leaves, he has to keep paying these bills. Whether it's an apartment on the other side of the railroad tracks or if it's still him in the marital home and she's gone, and he has to pay alimony and he has to pay child support. And I have seen so many times guys who are like, how am I supposed to pay this? There's no way I can pay this. I'm going to be living in my car. I'm not going to have any money. Wait, how am I even going to be able to keep my job? And we do not care. We're just like, this is the order. The judge gave us this order. This is what we're going to enforce. I mean, you need to figure something out. I mean, I don't know, go live with your parents again. It's unfortunate. It's very heartless. He's not going to be able to do it. And then then there's a whole nother thing, which we haven't even discussed, which is custody, right? Custody isn't like child support, where child support, there's a whole taxpayer funded system where someone could walk into child support. We're going to just do everything from A to Z. But with custody lives in the realm of what's called private family law, which means you have to pay the courts to get them to hear custody and to want to help you. Child support's not going to do that for you. So this guy is paying spousal. He's paying child support. He's trying to pay the bills where he can. He's working. Now he has to hire a custody, attorney and fight for custody. It's not going to happen. He's not going to be able to do it most of the time. So if she, and I think a lot of attorneys will probably tell you the worst kind of person to get divorced from is a stay-at-home, mom in this case, because the law is going to come down on you the hardest. So it gets really, really, really tough for those guys. And, frankly, a lot of people just end up not paying because either they just can't do it anymore or they can't. And then what we do is we charge interest on back pay. And this interest just keeps growing. It's not bankruptable unless if it's owed to the state, then you still can't bankrupt it. You can maybe negotiate with the state, depending on the state and how nice they want to be. And then if it's owed to mom, if it's very overwhelming. If it's owed to mom, she can forgive it. But how often does that happen? And it's not bankruptable. So it's when child support was beefed up in the 90s, the words they were using in Congress was, hey, we want to be as powerful as the IRS. And you don't mess with the IRS. And the child support is literally like the IRS's little brother or something.
Okay. I think you've painted a good picture of what's going to happen to this dad when his wife abandons him to go to try to for no fault. Now let's flip it around, and she's the stay-at-home mom. She's worked part-time doing this and that,
Sure.
And here, nothing there.
Okay.
She's got young kids. They've never been in daycare, and the ones that are old enough to go to school go to private schools.
She's got makes sense. She's got a 5 and a 9-year-old or something.
Oh, no, way more than that. These are like traditional Catholics that don't use
so they got like 3 or 4 kids or something.
They've got 5 kids ranging in age from 3 to 13 or 15.
Got it.
So
okay.
Whole grammar school and just starting high school age.
Yeah.
Dad is beside himself with whatever's going on at home. He wants to divorce his wife.
Okay. He meets a new nice young 20-something-year-old at work.
Yeah, whatever. Or right. Because I also hear that usually the men divorce because there's some other woman, and usually the women divorce because they're just falling out of love. But that's besides stereotypes. So anyways, this husband wants a divorce. So as long as they're in the same home, does he have grounds to file for divorce within the same home, or does he have to leave first?
Well, oh no, he can file. I mean, just because we have no fault divorce, so he can
Okay,
go
so
in
he
there and
files no fault
yeah,
divorce. He says, the word I see is equitable. The person who files wants equitable. They want
yeah,
equitable orders, and they also want custody. So he
yeah,
files for that.
uh-huh,
And he's got control of all the money because
yeah,
one that earns the income. And he could have gone to the bank the week before and
yeah,
opened a new account that the wife no longer has. Her credit
sure,
cards don't have a bank attached to anymore. So she
sure.
is totally,
She's got nothing.
she's got nothing. What's going to happen to that family in California divorce court?
Well, I mean, here's the thing that they're going to go through the divorce process. Um, Everything's going to be divided 50-50. You know, she is entitled to get alimony. She's going to be entitled to get child support. You know, eventually they're not going to be living in the same house at
Right.
that
Well,
point.
the husband wants the kids to go back and forth, and he wants to
Yeah.
take them to private schools because he knows that's a lot of money.
Yeah, well, so what's now it depends on probably the assets of the marriage, and it depends what the court's gonna want to do, because they might, you know, they might order certain things to continue or not. But if in the beginning of the process, if the mom's getting nothing from dad because the orders haven't been made yet and it just happened, he just left, she will probably go to a welfare agency and start getting some kind of cash aid. You know, at that point, child support's going to kick in automatically, and we're going to do our best to at least get child support flowing over to her.
Which doesn't
And
pay the utilities or the gasoline. I
doesn't
mean,
pay any of that. Yeah,
it's just
no,
kind of a
yeah.
nominal. I mean, in
I
Ohio,
think
it's kind of nominal. So
we're assuming at this point he's still paying. But what I've read a lot of divorce orders, and what's typically going to happen is the judge is going to order the dad to continue paying the bills, especially if the mom and all these kids are still in there. So the dad might be gone with his new
in
girlfriend.
the beginning, he's ordered to pay
Yes.
the bills.
Yes. So what she really should do is talk to a family law attorney just to get the process going. And by the end of it, what's probably also going to happen is he's going to be ordered to pay her attorney's fees because she doesn't work. She doesn't have anything. She's been a stay-at-home mom this whole time.
And
All
he
of their
wants
assets.
does the court want her to work? Does he want her to work? Is that up in the air now? The kids are going to be in daycare.
All of the courts. Well, I'll tell you this. It's going to go based off. This is the way I see it, and this is what I've seen a lot of. If mom's history was her whole time she was a stay-at-home mom and she's been doing this for years and has no career, it's going to be unreasonable for the courts to ask her to do this, especially if she still has, you know, even 50-50 custody. Yeah, 3-year-old. That's not going to be reasonable. So they're not going to order her off the bat. Now, if it's like a 50-50 custody case and mom had a master's degree and mom used to work before the kids and then after the kids they stopped and the kids, you know, depending on what that looks like, they could. I've seen that happen once where the courts will say we're going to use a presumed income, not a presumed. We're going to impute income on you for what we think you can make. Now, if the husband's still making a lot more, that doesn't mean she's not going to get spousal or child support. But they're going to say, hey, we're going to give you this now. We're going to continue this hearing, and you need to be looking for a job in this amount of time. Now, if it's under a 10-year marriage, typically alimony in a divorce case is half the length of the marriage. If it's over 10 years, then that can go on. So in that, 5 years time, if they're married for 10 years, then that 5 years of getting the alimony, she should be expected to do these kinds of things. But in the scenario you're telling us, this is a mom with, 4 or 5 kids. She's been a stay-at-home mom the whole time. She went into this marriage expecting to be a stay-at-home mom. The husband was providing for them, and this was the norm. Now, it is all still no fault, by the way. This is just how the laws work in the background in terms of divvying up assets. You know
Will
what I
they
mean?
divvy up the assets 50-50 generally because that's the
Yes.
default?
Yes, they will. Well, and when I say 50-50, yes, the husband is making 100% of the money, but since they're married, they're like one financial entity as they see it, and it's going to be divvied up in that way.
Because if they're
well,
going back and
they
forth,
would only
need a house.
If you have a house, and yeah, on a long enough timeline, what's eventually going to happen is one or the other will have to buy the other one out, or they will have to put up the house for sale. So, that's going to be the unfortunate thing for mom there. And But how and when this goes up for sale is also determined by the courts. So it, that's where it gets a little wiry. So they might still not force them to put it up for sale until mom's new situation gets figured out or something like
And
that.
mom, but so dad, because
Yeah.
the dad's income can support one household with 5
Yeah.
kids in a safe neighborhood, but
Yeah.
can the dad's income support 2 households with 5
No.
kids in a
No,
safe
and there's going to probably be a drop in
standard of
in the
living?
lifestyles of these kids. I mean, if they're all going to private school and
That's,
there's no way to pay that tuition, it's just not going to happen. If dad's
and
making a lot of money,
mom's ordered, she's imputed with
yeah.
some income. It's like, well, you haven't worked now, but you can get something. We're going to give you
Yeah.
however many months or years to get on your feet, and you're ordered to go do this, and your spousal support is going to change in coming years.
Yeah. Depending on how long the marriage was. The one you described with the 13-year-old, that's over 10 years.
Yeah, they were married over 10 years.
So that spousal support can continue up until she's either remarried or until the judge says to stop. There isn't technically lifetime alimony in California, but that doesn't mean you won't be paying for the rest of your life. It just means you can go and challenge the court about it.
Would it be accurate to say, in this scenario, the civil divorce court is going to end up, the outcome is going to be, given the standard of living we described, that neither of them can, the dad, between the two of them, they cannot afford 2 households for 5 kids in private schools in the same kind of neighborhood. They can't.
Yeah.
So that house is going to be sold. There's going to be 2 households somewhere where those kids are going back and forth that are suitable for 5 kids, and their standard of living is going to drop.
Yeah, more than likely. It's funny because if you look at the family codes, it will say that, essentially she's entitled to what was the lifestyle within the marriage. So they're holding them to a standard that was the lifestyle within the marriage, right? And that's kind of the justification for alimony and things like that. Now, depending on how,
Go ahead. It's impossible.
It really is. It is impossible to do that. Now, if they have a lot of money, maybe some people they can do that for. But for the most part, even spousal support is formulaic. I think you take her income or the higher income. They don't use gendered language in the family codes. It's like the supporting party and the supported party is what it's called. So the higher income minus the lower income, and it's some kind of split of what's left over for that. But yeah, so you're right. For most people, they're not going to be able to maintain that similar lifestyle. I mean, mom's probably going to end up in an apartment with the kids somewhere that's maybe cheaper in a different part of town. They will eventually have to sell that house. I mean, it depends how much is in the house, what she then decides to do with it after. But both of them able to do that on his one income, unless he's making a lot of money and they weren't living super extravagantly, is going to be very hard. And most people aren't going to be able to do that. That's why I always say, the people who lose here the most is the kids. And really, especially once you get attorneys involved, I've seen some divorce orders with some high amount of money because, you'll see all the assets. They get all this stuff out of you. You see how much money the families have. And I've seen divorce orders where, the dad's paid just, $170,000 to his attorneys plus another like $80,000 to hers. And it's crazy how much money. That's all future college tuition for these kids. And even, those are for high earners, but even for less earners, you're still paying thousands of dollars. A lot of this money that you're probably going to get from the house might even go to your attorneys and things like that. So
yeah, I've heard that.
And the thing is like, okay, it's one thing when you just look at the divorce, the event of divorce and the division of the nest egg that existed before. There's this ongoing situation where money that would have otherwise added to this nest egg for this family is now being drained. You got 2 SMUD bills, you got 2 gas, electric, you got 2 utility bills, 2 internet bills, 2 rents. Everything is split now, right? So it really is double the money, and it's all money that's not going to be there to help the children out for their marriages, And
this goes back to one of the.
It's funny that I said their marriages, but for their futures, yeah.
When Catholics talk about marriage in a technical way, they talk about what are its essential properties and what are the ends. So what makes marriage different than a relationship with anyone else? One of them is that it's permanent till one of you die. I mean, it's
Till
indissoluble.
death do us part would be the,
And
yeah.
it's that you're only going to have one spouse at a time. Unity. Well, I mean, you're only going to have one spouse at a time. No
Yeah,
polygamy.
well, like monogamous marriage,
And
lifetime monogamous marriage. Yeah.
And then, well, what are the ends? Like, what is this marriage? Okay, so you have this relationship. Well, what's this relationship for? Okay, great. We have this. What is it for? An essential end of marriage that makes it be what it is. Like, it's one of its defining characteristics. If you don't have that, two people decide to live together and like, well, I guess they're not having sex though, but that's it. Anyways, is children. So being oriented towards having children is part of what makes marriage different than other relationships. And there's a secondary end, which is, in me describing it, some philosopher professor would say, oh my gosh, Faye, you are so wrong, but you're trying. I see you're trying. The primary end of marriage is the procreation and upbringing of children with this goal of they're going to spend time in eternity forever with God. And then the secondary end, the means by which you do that, well, how do you do that? In the old Latin code of canon law, it was mutium adiutorium, which is mutual help. And it's the spouses are expected to help each other and help the children. But it's mutual help.
It's duty, mutual duty. Yeah.
It's one household.
Yeah.
So what divorce does is it frees the both part. What no fault divorce does is it tries to erase the obligation of the parties to do mutual help in one household.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is if I was going to sum it up from what I'm understanding, is some kind of, it's a moral obligation, a duty, an obligation that people have. And no fault divorce, unfortunately, puts all morality in the backseat, or frankly, just out the window. And it's just this kind of administrative, just, it's all about the money and just splitting the money and the assets. And it's way too focused on that. And there really isn't this moral duty or obligation, because one person can just get up and leave at any time, frankly. And, I do agree with you. It's like marriage is supposed to be this kind of joint thing. And there is an economic aspect of that. There definitely is, as well as a spiritual aspect on both sides. And a big thing is supposed to be for the children. It's supposed to, humans come up with this problem of you have stuff, you have whether it's your culture and your values or actual material things and beliefs and things. And the question is how do we pass this torch on to the next generation to keep this entire train going in the same direction or whatever? And marriage is a fundamental tool in civilization in order to help thread all these things together. And that, creates intergenerational wealth. It creates families that are firmly rooted in the land that they're at. And just me working at this place, reading all these divorce orders, I'm able to clearly see that passing on generational wealth in the U.S. has become extremely difficult because marriages keep dissolving. And that's just the end of the money for a lot of people.
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah, because the lawyers, what do lawyers charge? In Ohio, this was like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
One was 300, one was 280. There was if mommy and daddy don't agree on what to do with the children, the court will order assets to be used to pay a court government psychologist who affirms no fault.
Yeah, or supervised visitation or something.
The kids have to have a children's attorney. In Ohio, the attorney is also their guardian ad litem. I've heard different states have the guardian ad litem not be an attorney or whatever. So it's like all these marital assets are going to these players
it's
in an industry that's not industrious. It produces nothing.
There's an entire industry around that drains money. But then there's all this issue of like, it's hard to hold on to property because now the property needs to be sold.
You went through the list.
Yeah, now we have to pay double the bills.
Utilities.
Yeah, so all these things happen. And if you look at one thing that I've taken an interest in recently, just because I find it fascinating, is the concept of the dowry. And very specifically in Western civilization, all throughout Christendom, and up until very recently, there was a dowry-based system. And, a lot of times a feminist might say, well, how come, only the men inherit from the parents and the women don't get anything? The women's inheritance is essentially the dowry. And the daughters of the family get part of the wealth to then take into their new marriage, and that helps kickstart this young couple. And then the man grows into being the provider and all this stuff, and then they have kids and they pay it forward. The sons, on the other hand, in a patrilineal fashion, then get the inheritance, which is typically the immovable stuff like the house and the land and all these kinds of things, where a woman's getting like valuables in the other sense. And that's interesting to me because that is actually how intergenerational wealth threads through the society, and it's done properly. What happens now, though, is that, we've kind of replaced that with, love, let's marry for love and all these kinds of things, which, yeah, hey, great. But that's kind of become front and center, which is, you can even say that's selfish in a way. But then it's like back when you had that system, divorce wasn't as easy to do. And especially if someone was going to divorce for frivolous reasons, you now have to figure out, am I going to pay this dowry back? That was a big thing in King Henry's divorce also, of what they were going to do about that. I mean, there's a lot of, it wasn't just these noble royalty people doing that. This went all the way down to the bottommost fringes of society. The way they got a lot of women over to the New World was that the crown was offering them dowries to take with them so they can go to the New World to then get married. So if you didn't have that, you probably weren't getting married. It's also a mechanism that helps stop maybe a bunch of children being born who otherwise can't be taken care of, because, hey, you're not ready for marriage until you have a little bit of this. So there's this whole economic side to it, which is important. And then once the families figure that out, they would then go to the church, and the church would make it this sacred thing. And so you have both aspects of it, a material and a spiritual aspect. Over here, it has become but a shadow of what it used to be. And you can't, it's so hard, and it's not a guarantee to put intergenerational wealth. So you can't build up and have strong families, which ultimately is going to lead to a strong nation. People will just divorce, whenever they want to. And one of the biggest things for me, you probably heard me say it before, I don't know if I said it in the Baskerville interview, but the thing I learned from working at child support is that the state has actually created a lot of alternative legal structures and mechanisms that make even the state's version of marriage obsolete. So at-fault divorce and things like that used to give men these benefits to sign that contract. So it's like, okay, the kids born from my wife are my kids, and this random guy who's an affair partner can't say, hey, I want custody of the kids from your marriage. And things like, there were just all these things.
The women too. The women
yeah,
too.
The women also.
Like in the old understanding of marriage.
Yeah.
If I want to be integrally a part of the upbringing of my children, and I don't want the school forming their minds or the media forming their minds, and if I'm willing to stay home with my kids because I think that's a good idea, that's a huge risk.
Yeah, it is. Both parties are doing that.
From now, he's going to divorce you. You're going to be living in a small apartment. You're going to have no assets. You're going to be living on mediocre alimony, and you're going to be impoverished.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the state doesn't even incentivize people to sign the marriage contract, because for paternity, not anymore. And all they've done is chopped at the tree of it. And it's supposed to be a legal structure that's strong, that incentivizes people to take part in the contract. But instead, like, we have a program called the Voluntary Declaration of Paternity. And when a lot of kids were being born out of wedlock here in the 60s after the sexual revolution, the state was having trouble because if they want to go after child support, they can't take money from someone unless they can say, hey, legally, this person's the father. So what they did is they created this program to when you're at the hospital, and what they realize is when a baby's being born, there's a high likelihood both of the parents are going to be together at that event. So there's a new document they invented back then called the Voluntary Declaration of Paternity. And when you sign that, if you're out of wedlock, it counts just the same legally as you being in wedlock. So you're now legally the father of this kid. Okay. Prior to that, that's one step for me devaluing the marriage contract, because now it's like, oh, I can have this thing outside of the marriage contract. Okay. So they did that. So that now creates another pathway for me. Then there's custody. They have kind of taken custody and stuff out of really what is marriage and say, oh, it's about cohabitation, right? So if I can go to the courts and say I've cohabitated with this child up until the child was 6 and then, mom left or my girlfriend left me and took the kids, God forbid. I can go in there and make a claim for custody because it's more about cohabitation than it is about marriage as far as the state's concerned. So guys can look at this and say, well, the marriage contract only screws me started to use that language. And I can just sign this document at the hospital and have the same rights that a husband would have over these children. And as long as we're living together, then fine. Now, okay, hey, I guess if you know how to work the system and you know how to do that, then good for you. But the long-term sort of unfortunate thing about all of these things that they've created in order to accommodate people who are doing things, let's just say the way they weren't traditionally done, has only hurt that traditional thing more, because now they can avail themselves of that, right?
Well,
So that combined with the welfare system and all these things, it's too different now. It's very different now. And
that's where I've started to say, when I started doing my work, the divorce world would say, hey, you got your state marriage license, so of course you're under our jurisdiction, so you do what we say, you leave the religious stuff to the church.
yeah,
And then I'm starting to say now, what the state does, it's actually not marriage, because the authentic understanding of marriage from the Catholic perspective and for millennium had been indissolubility, openness to
yes,
children. You are the parent to those children, working together
yeah.
in one household. I mean, your wife might be a piece of work and she's a nasty person and she lies all the time. You
But the
couldn't.
contract was still powerful enough that they're bound by the terms of this,
Yeah, and
the
that's what the whole
conditions.
culture did. So now
Yeah.
what the government's doing, I think they're the ones who mutilated the word. It's like, it's not even marriage. So I think, it's like state regulated pairing.
Yeah,
Or something.
yeah, it's like you could say that, like a state partnership contract. But then the thing is that most people, I've heard there's a attorney who's pretty famous now called James Sexton, and he always says that it's a contract people sign that they haven't read the terms to, and because the family code is the terms of the contract, but
Right. Yep.
they
Was
don't show you that when you sign it. You just sign your, there's the marriage license and certificate
he
and all
interviewed
these
by
things.
Matt Walsh in the last couple months?
Do you say Matt Walsh?
Did Matt
Sorry.
Walsh interview? There was some lawyer who's a New York
Oh,
super
James Sexton. He did. That was him.
divorce
Matt
lawyer.
Walsh interviewed him. Yes, I
Yes,
saw that interview.
I made a
Yeah.
blog. I made a blog. With
Yeah,
the Sexton
he's the
book.
guy that says that, which I always thought is very true, because and one of the things about marriage too is it was really negotiated up front. People knew the terms of it going in, right? Even if you just think of something as simple as the vows, right? In sickness and in health, till death do us part. All these kinds of things, which is really interesting. Unfortunately, now it's like people, they don't take the contract seriously because it's not really enforced seriously in the way that it used to be, since it's no
Right.
fault. So you can go in and do this whole extravagant symbolic thing, and the families are there and everybody's smiling and people are crying. It's so beautiful. Oh my God. And then, they can just walk out whenever they want. No fault divorce, unfortunately, really, really hurt marriage. And then child support and these other things after it really help to put more
Here,
nails
here I
in
want to
it.
bring you back to my
Yeah.
fictitious audience at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Yeah.
Catholics have this sour taste in our mouth about the notion of a prenup, because if you do a prenup, you're signing an agreement on how things might be split if you divorce. I think getting a state marriage license is a prenup, because you are agreeing on paper when you go get that state marriage license that I agree to the rights and obligations that my state code says. So
That's what you're doing. You're agreeing to what the family code says is the law governing, marriage. It's not even just marriage. It's just the entire family code system. That might not even have anything to do. I mean, that's stuff outside of marriage, right? Custody has been pulled out of marriage, and it's its own thing, like child support is
right.
its own thing.
I understand in your work it was, but from
Yeah.
the Catholic marriage perspective,
Oh yeah, that's part of marriage.
Someone
Yeah.
goes down the aisle and does what has been their great
Yeah.
grandparents did, and they're making
Yeah.
these promises that have these essential properties and these ends, and
Yeah.
secondary ends, and mutual help, and all this.
Now you're signing a state, I guess you could say prenup. That is kind of what it is in the event of divorce. That this is what it is.
The one. This is the one that gets enforced.
Yeah.
Who's
I guess
enforcing
people.
the one that says, "Hey, Mister, if you're gonna dump your wife with the 5 kids,
This is
you
what's going
promised
to
when you
happen.
got married to uphold mutual help in one household, and it includes the upbringing of those children with the goal of them having a mind and heart that's suited for eternity." Like they could go and rebel and all, but we're not talking about that. At least we're trying.
Yeah.
So that husband would be held accountable to do what he agreed when he married the lady and the kids.
Yeah.
That's not what happens in no fault. They lose the house. They split everything. She's impoverished. Kids lose their,
And if she does something that's really bad, um, she can still take advantage of that system, especially if she's a stay-at-home mom.
She
I
can
mean,
be the adulterer. Right. The
yeah,
stay-at-home mom that commits.
that's kind of the problem for men is that, well, the I'm still going to have to face all of these consequences. Let's say if I do something, not like they want to do something, but when it happens, even if the wife just decides to get up and go one day or say no, I mean, she's more than likely going to get custody. She's definitely going to get all these other monetary things that come with it, and you're going to lose a lot of what you've been working hard to create, unfortunately. And so, it's a tough position, and that's where you get a lot of men kind of checking out.
I know.
Ultimately, I
Men
think
walking away from women, mewa.
yeah, which is unfortunate. I think a lot of guys would otherwise rather do that, or otherwise rather, have kids and families and things. But they really need to make it in a way that's going to make sense. It's we live in this very weird sort of blurred lines, gray area society now, and it's almost kind of schizophrenic or bipolar in a way where you're hearing one thing from one side, one thing from the other, and it gets very confusing, especially for young men. I think there's a lot of pressure on young men,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I'm the mom of 4 young men.
Wow, 4 boys.
Caucasian, so they're like, oh man.
Yes, they're getting looked at funny, right? So
Yeah,
that's
you're
that.
you're the bottom of the totem pole right now. But
Yeah, well, see, that's an interesting thing too, right? Because it's like, you know, I know there's a lot of women out there, especially with sons, and there's a difference between single moms who maybe don't understand what goes into raising a boy into a man, but then there's married mothers who do want what's best for their sons, and they're probably watching this and they're just like, hoping for the best, or just what can I do to make sure to get this back on track for them. It's tough. I think of a family I know. I mean, it's a Christian family. They're not Catholic, but it's 4 boys, and I grew up with them around the corner. They're some of my best friends, and I kind of saw. Had the privilege of seeing what happened to these 4 boys, and they have taken 4 radically different paths, so to say. One out of the 4 is in a great marriage. I think they got 4 or 5 kids now. They're doing great. Another one went through a really tough divorce, and I saw that whole thing happen. And then another one kind of went the whole, I'm an atheist liberal now, and then the other one, he's trucking, he's moving on, doing good. But it's just interesting because you think that the culture and the way the laws are, it's very corrosive. It's very tough to hold traditional values and not be constantly going through that. But at the same time, that's just, I don't know. That's just unfortunately where we are today. So
all right,
I can see that. Yeah.
Well, you've covered what I was interested in covering, which is what's going to happen in these scenarios in a no-fault system, and how is this contrast to what would happen if someone was trying to enforce the original understanding of marriage that was centuries ago, which is mutual help is part of it, and adultery is the reason to be separated. And if you're committing adultery, you're the one who's at fault. And justice, again, the philosopher PhD is going to laugh at me because I say it incorrectly, but like justice is giving somebody their due. So what is due? If a woman only agreed to have kids with a guy if they were going to be together for life, and he dumps her when she's got kids ranging in age from 13 to 4, what is due to the woman in justice, and to the children who wouldn't have been conceived without that promise being made? And the same thing for the guy when the wife is sick of him and she moves in with her boss. It's like, what's due in justice? And what's happening right now with no-fault divorce, I mean, to me, it's obvious that it's not just, but I kind of, if they don't understand my understanding of marriage, and marriage is just this government regulated pairing that has temporary rights and obligations that are controlled by the state. That's all I have.
Justice is really the appropriate topic for that, because prior to no fault, justice and restoring justice for who was the injured party was very important. But no fault is essentially just administrative, bureaucratic style stuff, which is unfortunately divorced from any kind of justice or morality. So a lot of people are starting to wake up to that now. I think a lot of people, especially in the generation before mine, signed up for that, kind of expecting what you're describing, what a system that's more just, but then found out they were actually living in one that is amoral, I think would be the best way to put it. So
Worse than unjust, immoral
yes.
in a vacuum. Yeah, and yeah, we could go on. Well, I'm ready to wrap up.
Yeah, no worries. Sounds good. I appreciate you having me on, and I'll watch for when you post this, and I'll share it on with my audience also.
Okay,
So, thanks for
thanks.
having me.
We'll pray somebody at the USCCB is like, yeah, I think marriage licenses are prenups. We should probably look into that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Well, I'll be watching.
All right. Bye, Shaw. I'm going to end the
Bye.
recording.